Disproving a scientific theory is just as important as proving a scientific theory. In modern science today, nobody seems to be interested in elimination any longer. Unfortunately, the day we live in now, or the time period we live in now, science really does believe they have it all figured out. They're done, right? We have the creation of the entire universe completely figured out. The Big Bang Jesus Christ. The Big Bang completely explains where the entire universe came from, and of course, ultimately you. And when we start to look at where you came from, beyond the Big Bang, evolution has all of that figured out as well. When we look at the creation and formation of the Earth, we have the accretion disk model that scientists, or mainstream scientists, currently use as a mass explanation that is not allowed to be challenged for the creation of the Earth. And when we zoom into the Earth itself, we find that there are geological processes taking place. And once again, mainstream scientists have an explanation for everything with respect to how the Earth operates. Plate tectonics being the essential staple of why the planet is the way it is. This explains why we find continents the way we find the continents. This explains mountains, oceans, etc. The theory of plate tectonics is essentially the foundation for all of geology in modern science. Now, this would not be a problem if plate tectonics actually had satisfied all of the requirements of the scientific method. Unfortunately for modern geologists, this has not happened. Right now, we find a situation to where a theory is being taught as fact. When you go and you start to learn even the most basic geology and geological principles, you find that you are going to only be exposed to the plate tectonic theory, and you will never be exposed to other potential explanations as to why we find the Earth with the kind of geological makeup that we find it. This is not how you do science. You have a theory, that's fine. There's no problem having a theory. But if your theory remains a theory because there is a lack of scientific evidence to prove your theory, you do not get to teach your theory as a fact. You do not get to make a theory the foundational backbone of a science. That is not how it works. Now, I get it. Right now, people are probably getting ready to shut this off because it sounds like schizo garbage. I understand. But let me ask you this, or ask yourself this question. What evidence that you personally saw, what scientific, testable evidence did you see that convinced you that plate tectonics has to be a legitimate explanation for everything we see right now? Now, if you ask yourself this question honestly and you respect the scientific method, I think you're going to find yourself in one hell of a problem. Because what's going to happen is that you are going to find yourself in a situation to where you have precisely zero testable evidence that conclusively proves the concept of plate tectonics. It does not exist. Right now, plate tectonics makes no predictions that have been fulfilled accurately by geologists. To further prove this point, or to put it on a more basic level, if plate tectonics was the actual explanation as to why the Earth is, formed, as to why we see the Earth in the way we see it today, we should have zero issue, nada, no problem predicting earthquakes. How many accurate earthquakes have you ever seen predicted by geologists? None. They don't do it. They don't have any predictive power. If your theory has no predictive power, guess what that means for your theory? Yeah, it means it's garbage. It means it's trash. When your theory has no successful predictions, you have to move on. That's it. It's done. This is basic science. This is not me being a schizo. This is literally how we are supposed to do science. If your theory does not agree with observation, your theory must be discarded. Today, we are going to look at discarding the theory of plate tectonics. Now, I'm not doing this because I woke up one day from some kind of a crazy schizo dream and thought, oh yeah, wow, plate tectonics, impossible. This ghost talked to me in my dreams and said, no, you can't do that. The world doesn't operate like that. Go spread the word that plate tectonics is wrong because, I don't know, some weirdo in your dream told you. That is not what's happening. We have to discard the theory of plate tectonics because right now it does not meet any of the required scientific criteria for the theory to be taught in any way, shape, or form as a foundation for an entire scientific principle. We are not in that position. Plate tectonics is a bad theory. Now, all right, fine, prove it. Yeah, let's do that. Let's prove it. Now, before we get into this, really quick, I want to make sure that we are all on an equal playing field. For those of you who are about to shut this off simply because plate tectonics has to be real and there's no way any other explanation could be possible, I would say bear with me, and at the very least, you have no choice but to agree with me that right now, geologists have zero predictive power when it comes to predicting earthquakes. They should have this locked down, or they should at least have a very high success rate if the theory was correct. The simple fact that geologists right now are incapable of predicting any kind of an earthquake whatsoever, essentially, is really all the proof I need to show to, at the very least, allow for a different scientific approach when trying to explain the geological processes on this planet. There's no way around this, by the way. For anybody who doesn't want to pay attention to this stuff, that's fine, but what that means is that that proves that that person is not interested in the truth. And I don't say this from a vindictive point of view or anything. I love everybody. But the reality is, people who choose to turn a blind eye to real science, I mean, what are we supposed to do with that? If somebody is not going to pay attention to the real science right in front of them and instead are just going to pay attention to propaganda, that's not science. Or at least it's not the science we're going for. What that science is the science of psychological conditioning. All of these geologists that are running around saying that plate tectonics is the, one true theory that has to explain everything, and there's no way to deviate from this, and there's no way we could ever listen to potential other theories. I mean, this is literally 100% a product of psychological conditioning. Like I said, when we find that a theory does not match objective scientific evidence, you have to throw the theory away. So why is plate tectonics at the very least not put to one side? And it's simple. It's simply because everybody has been told that plate tectonics is real. If you are told something enough, you will eventually believe it. And don't forget, if you're also wondering, by the way, why? Well, how is it possible that all of these really hyper smart people in college and these professors and people like that, how could they be wrong? I mean, they have a little piece of paper that says that they're a doctor in geology. I mean, how can that guy be wrong? He's got to be smart to get that degree, right? No, you just need to be able to push the party line. That's it. As long as you conform, you are in. To make matters worse, of course, speaking from a scientific perspective when it comes to psychology, the smarter you are, the easier you are to control. It is that simple. There is no way around this. That was proved scientifically decades ago, and it has since been corroborated, hey, by real good science. How do you like that? Real good science proves that the smarter you are, the easier you are to control. So if I can control a smart person easier, having them believe in a situation like plate tectonics is easy. It's child's play. It's not a problem, okay? Now, I won't go any further with that stuff. My main point is that right now, plate tectonics is taught as if it is an established fact, and the reality is, it couldn't be further from the truth. It has no predictive power. It's done nothing. The theory doesn't work. Now, of course, your next question should be directed at me. Okay, Schizo, if you're going to say that plate tectonics is not real, then what's your theory, bro? I mean, what is your explanation? And I'll be honest with you, right now, we do not have enough scientific evidence to come to any kind of a conclusive solution to the problem. And I admit that right up front. This is what mainstream geology will never do. They will never tell you, hey, look, by the way, the theory of plate tectonics, it's one theory among other possibilities which also have a lot of scientific backing. Mainstream geologists, they will never do that. They are never going to present another potential explanation for why we see what we see with respect to geology. It's not going to happen. So right there, actually, that's another bullet point for us. The very second we see an establishment that's supposed to exist in a scientific format completely ignoring all the other potential theories, which are backed up by science, by the way, we have a situation to where we can scientifically prove that that academic institution is corrupt and is not interested in real science. They are interested in pushing a message, and that is it. Now, it might sound weird, like you're probably thinking, okay, wait a second. So are you saying there's some kind of a crazy conspiracy by mainstream geologists to hide something? No, I would not say by mainstream geologists. It's really important to understand and remember that mainstream geologists, probably like 99.9% of them, they have no idea what they're peddling. They honestly believe that when they talk about plate tectonics, that they are doing this from a truly honest academic perspective, and they honestly believe in what they are teaching. So it's kind of it's hypocritical at the end of the day, though, isn't it? Right? These mainstream geologists, they literally hold a conflicting opinion in their brain, in their psychology, and they don't even notice it. They push the theory of plate tectonics while simultaneously ignoring all of the evidence that proves it either wrong or all of the evidence that supports other possible explanations. These people don't know to look for other explanations. I know these guys are smart. I'm not saying they're stupid. These geologists are legitimately intelligent. But when you have that level of psychological control over somebody, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, right? They're going to push whatever somebody at the top wants them to push. Now that brings us to the next interesting part. Is there really some kind of a power structure, like, more towards the top of the planet's socioeconomic power structure, that doesn't want your average human to understand how the planet works? It's kind of a weird thing to think about. Why hide that? Why go out of your way to try to make sure that your average person doesn't understand basic geology? I mean, why would you even waste resources on that? Unfortunately, the answer is, it's kind of messed up, but there is an answer. Here's the answer. When we look back at our historical past and we read and listen to what our ancestors recorded, we find a completely different version of history than right now what is supported by the mainstream. And I mean completely different in the truest sense. Now, one of the things that we find that is different is the fact that all of our ancestors record particular periods of time of tremendous amounts of catastrophes, right? And it's not just little local earthquakes or little local tsunamis. Our ancestors describe just absolute chaos, not only on Earth, but up in the sky, up in space. Of course, mainstream historians have completely ignored everything that our ancestors recorded, and they've decided to make up their own history. Whoever makes up the history is going to have a tremendous amount of power in modern day society, right? He who controls the past controls the present. So there is a vested interest just from a basic psychological level of greed in the human mindset that would benefit if you could control the perception of what happened in our recent past. If you can do that, then you have an incredible foundation on which to build up your power within a global society, right? And that's exactly what they're looking for. They're no longer looking for distinction. They want everybody to be one massive lump of human flesh that they can control. And that's exactly what's happening with this. So right now, what's going on is that the upper power structure is obfuscating real geology. If you can convince scientists that something completely different happened and is an explanation for what we witness on this planet right now, as opposed to looking for the truth, then, I mean, to be blunt, you have a really good level of control. But what that also does is that disconnects. It creates a disassociative state in the social structure for your average person. And that disconnect that has been created using the theory of plate tectonics, what that does, what pushing plate tectonics has actually done, and I know most people don't even think of it like this, but this is the scientific truth. What it's done is it's severed our connection to the experiences of our ancestors. What that does is it furthers the dissociative psychological state, which then puts the human masses on this planet into a position to where you are more easily psychologically conditioned. And that is exactly what we see today. So what's going on right now is there's probably somebody on this planet who knows exactly what happened in the past. There's somebody on this planet, I guarantee it, that is well aware of how real geology works. And those people, or that person, or whatever, they have gained tremendous control, and they are making sure that nobody pays attention or can find the truth. So, when we look at something like plate tectonics, there's more at stake than just not understanding geological processes. There is our history and who we are at the core at stake. This is what is being erased by doing something like this, by obfuscating the most basic of scientific principles. And most people don't even think like this, right? Most people do not associate the theory of plate tectonics with psychological control. Like, nobody's doing that. And the reason why is because, basically nobody's been taught to do that. That kind of science is not being taught in, universities and stuff like that. Therapists would probably be the closest people to hear something like this, but no professor is going to say, oh, hey, by the way, check out all these awesome tricks being used in mainstream society to, control all of your patients. Like, that's not happening, right? No psychologist is getting that kind of tutelage. It's not going down like that. They're getting the basic by-the-book garbage, and that is all they are going to know. And then if you give them a degree and now they're accredited by that same corrupt institution, then they can say that you're an insane schizo when you try to say anything against something like plate tectonics. And that is exactly the situation we are in. Okay, you guys get it. Now, purely from a scientific perspective, it is our job as researchers, historians, and scientists to analyze a proposed theory, especially one that is being used as the foundational basis for an entire science. And we should question that, because if we're going to use something like this as a foundation, it better be right. Like, this better be 100% correct. And it better have and satisfy all the requirements of the scientific method, right? And that's not happening with plate tectonics. Here's why this is important to history. Like I said earlier, our ancestors do not record the concept of plate tectonics, right? They're not sitting there saying, well, the continents are moving away from each other about a centimeter a year, or whatever, estimates they have now for whatever garbage that they're talking about. Nobody's talking about plate tectonics. Nobody's saying anything about the mountains being slowly created. There's no god of plate tectonics in anybody's past, right? Now, I know right now you can say, well, dude, they were all monkeys. They did not have the technology to really pay attention to plate tectonics. I get that. But here's the interesting thing. None of our ancestors talk about a situation to where mountains were built slowly over time. we find a really weird problem, for example, in geology, to where all of our ancestors, all of them, without exception, unless they were not present in the area, for example, everybody says that all of the mountain ranges shot up literally overnight. The Andes, the Sierra Nevadas, the Alps, etc. It doesn't matter, the Rockies. It does not matter. All of our ancestors claim that these mountains were built overnight. They did not slowly build up. Nobody talks about any kind of a slow buildup of anything ever. Now, mountain building is a geological process. So why is it that we find all of our ancestors all over this planet talking about mountains being built overnight? Nobody is talking about mountains slowly rising. Nobody even contemplates it. It's actually fairly weird in any case at all, if you think about it, that everybody has the identical story for how mountains were built. This is a serious problem, and this is a problem for geologists. Now, again, on the surface, this kind of sounds weird because I'm basically asking our ancestors to have been able to have possibly proven the concept of plate tectonics. You know, they did not, as far as I know, they didn't have that kind of technology or anything like that. And I grant that. But we also have to realize that all of our ancestors talk about geological processes, and none of them are talking about anything happening slowly. So we find ourselves in a situation to where geologists have decided to completely ignore history, which is ironic because geologists will generally use historians' datings to prove their geological layers quite often. And it's, yeah, how do you like that circular logic? The whole thing is just absolute clown show. It's crazy. But the fact that everybody ignores our ancestors, that's a problem. Our ancestors took the time to record events they claim that they saw, and they did their best to transmit that down to you and me. We probably should maybe pay attention to it. It gets even funnier, of course, for example, with the mountain building situation, when geologists, starting in the late 1800s, actually started to prove that all mountain ranges on this planet are indeed relatively new. And I do not mean relatively new as in like, they popped up like 10 million years ago or something like that. Oh, no. Geologists, mainstream geologists, this is important, mainstream geology has proven now that all of the mountain ranges that we see right now on this planet gained their present elevation only in the past few thousand years. There is no scientific way around this. So when we find evidence like that, and we see our ancestors talking about mountain building events only a couple thousand years ago, I don't know, you would think that maybe you would start paying attention to what our ancestors recorded. That doesn't happen, does it? No. Plate tectonics remains the theory of mountain building and everything. I mean, really, if you want to be honest about it, they completely ignore the science that has proven that mountains did not take tens of millions of years to build up, and they ignore our ancestors. We are not going to do that. Instead, what we will do is we are going to analyze the theory of plate tectonics in a real scientific light, and then we will look at potential alternative theories right now that explain current geological processes that are taking place on this planet right in front of our face. Because there is other explanations. Most people don't even know that. Most people do not even realize that there are other superior, scientifically based explanations for why we see the Earth in the way we see it today. Geologically, of course. All right, so let's go over the basics of the theory of plate tectonics, and then we will start to rip it apart using real science. The theory of plate tectonics essentially explains the structure and the movement of the Earth's lithosphere. And what it does is that it provides a framework for their understanding of geological processes, such as things like earthquakes, volcanic activity, mountain building, etc., etc. Mountain or ocean building, you don't really build them. You know what I mean? The creation of oceans. Shut up. All right, so here's some of their key concepts of what goes into the theory. The main aspect of the theory is, of course, the tectonic plates. What they believe is essentially that the lithosphere is divided into several large and small plates. The lithosphere, by the way, essentially comprises the Earth's crust and the upper mantle. Then we have the asthenosphere underneath the lithosphere, and the asthenosphere is essentially it's like the semi-fluid layer that flows, it's where all the magma stuff is. This is what they consider the plastic layer that the plates will move on top of. So these plates are essentially floating on a sea of magma. Now the idea here is that the Earth is fractured into those plates, and as the magma underneath the plates shifts and moves, so the plates move as well. As the plates move, they run into each other, or they move away from each other, or they ride up on top of each other, or they get pushed down underneath one another. There's all kinds of movements going on in all kinds of directions, oddly enough. The funny part about the plates and their movements is that when you look at the movement directions of the plates that right now geologists believe in, that really should have been the first red flag that something's not quite adding up with their theory. Of course, that didn't happen, and the plates move in the directions that they move just because they do, bro. Don't ask questions. I mean, that's almost quite literally their explanation. Well, all right, we'll get into it. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, as these plates move around the planet, very, very slowly, this is how mountains will eventually be built, for example. So right now, geologists believe that there would be, say, two plates that smash together, and this smashing together of two plates builds up the tall mountains that we see today. Now, mainstream geologists, of course, adhere to the theory of uniformity, so that means that all of these mountaintops that say, are 20,000 feet plus high in the air took hundreds of millions of years to build. There's already a direct problem with this, and I wonder if any of you guys immediately thought about it. The problem with this part of the theory right off the bat is that for some weird reason, apparently erosion does not take place on Earth while mountains are being built. You see where I'm going with that? So if you're going to have 20,000 foot high mountains being built over hundreds of millions of years, how is that happening, and how are these mountains avoiding the general erosion that geologists also claim happens simultaneously? So what I mean by that is, for example, if you're only pushing a mountain up a few centimeters a year at best, what happens if a lot of wind or water rushes over that particular new mountain formation? It's going to be eroded, and it's not going to take much. I'm not talking about hurricane force winds, although obviously that's not going to help. I'm just talking about general year-to-year wear and tear on the planet, right? You go outside right now, you can watch layers being blown away right in your front yard, basically, if you don't have grass and stuff planted. You can just watch it erode away. Like, it just goes. It's gone. There is nothing being built up over years that you're alive. What we see when we look around is that we find that erosion is, of course, taking place. And geologists admit this, but what they don't admit is that the erosion would have eroded down any mountain range that would have attempted to be built up. There's no way around this, right? I don't know what to tell geologists. You cannot tell me an erosion rate per year is several centimeters of the ground, while simultaneously telling me that mountains are being built up at the same rate as the erosion. It's insane, right? It's doublethink. These people hold two conflicting principles in their head, and they do not make the connection. This is extraordinarily basic observational science. There's nothing else I can say about this. Mountain building with respect to the geological tectonic plate theory is a dumb idea. It doesn't even make sense. It doesn't work. It doesn't even work within the frame of their own data. The reason why they get away with this, and we might as well cover this right now as well. I should have already said this. But the reason why they get away with this is they can say, well, I mean, it happened, 200 million years ago. I can't really prove or disprove what was really going on back there. So that means you have to believe my theory because I can't prove it. That is what they say. That is literally what you are forced to believe if you are going to believe in plate tectonics. If you call out the simple fact of what I just said about erosion, if you just bring that up, you're the schizo. You're the problem, even though I am using their own data. Like, it's not, I didn't make that data up. I didn't make that erosional data up. That's what they came up with. So how the hell are we building up mountains over millions of years if we are also experiencing mass amounts of erosion? This is a serious problem for geologists. And I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, back to the basics of the theory. Oh, Jesus. I don't really have a format either, so if we're bouncing around, that's because I'm stupid and don't plan anything in advance, because I just get pissed and then operate on pure anger, and then I go and I make a YouTube video about that, right? So I'm trying to control my anger using YouTube, right? It's probably not the smartest thing to do. All right, let's go over the staples of the theory of plate tectonics. Let's go and analyze what is required for this theory to work. And then once we kind of start digging into this, we will then question all of those mechanics that right now mainstream geologists claim can't be questioned, basically. So let's start right at the beginning. What's the first ingredient we are going to need if anything is going to move? I mean, if we are going to have any kind of motion, any kind of angular momentum, we need something. And that something is energy, right? Nothing moves for free. Like, continents are not floating around because of some magical free energy. There has to be an engine. What is the driving force? Well, there's a few explanations that geologists have come up with, so let's go over this really quick. As a funny side note, you're going to notice that there is going to be one missing force that exists that has been proved to be scientifically present that geologists will not be discussing. Let's see if you guys can guess what that force is once we're done going over this list. For plate tectonics to work at all, essentially what we have to create is a ton of heat. Heat is going to be the driving force for this theory. Now, the heat that supplies the energy and all of the movement to this whole process is not conclusively proved. This is the first thing to remember. I'm going to go over some of the, or maybe all of them actually. We're going to go over the major points that creates the heat within Earth, supposedly. Remember, this is according to mainstream geology. So it's important to remember that everything that we list right here is all on the theoretical side of things. Now, that does not mean that there is not basis in fact with respect to how some of this stuff works. The issue that we are going to run into is the way geologists use these sciences to support their trash theory. So geologists require a ton of heat to get all of these processes moving. Where does this heat come from? So the first place geologists say that the heat comes from would be the residual heat from the Earth's formation 4.5 billion years ago. Of course, geologists follow mainstream cosmological theories, and of course, mainstream cosmology claims that an accretion disk is essentially what formed all of the planets. You know, there's a bunch of dirt and rocks and dust and stuff floating around the sun, and over billions of years, they all magically combine together through the incredibly weak force of gravity, and as the incredibly weak force of gravity somehow magically combines all of this debris, everything gets compacted together. When you start to compact something, you create heat. So right from the get-go, we are already building one theory on top of another theory. The worst part about this situation, or the funniest part about this situation, is that the accretion disk model that geologists are just assuming is correct has precisely 0 successful predictions. I'm going to say that one more time, just in case everybody didn't understand what I just said. The theory that geologists are using to claim where the heat came from is based on another theory which has 0 successful predictions. I mean, what are you supposed to do with that? A mainstream geologist will look you right in the eye and have 0 issue telling you that the theory of plate tectonics, which is built on top of another theory with precisely 0 evidence, is correct. So right there, the theory of plate tectonics immediately fails the scientific method. You cannot build a theory off of another theory that has 0 evidence. That's just not how you're supposed to do science, but that is how mainstream academia does science. They have no problem with this. They have 0 issue telling you that this is where the heat from the Earth comes from. And of course, if you do not nod your head in approval to their childish theory, then you're the schizo, you're the crackpot, you are the conspiracy theorist. Yeah, this is literally the kind of people that we are dealing with. Never forget that. Remember, mainstream people, they are walking hypocritical, I won't say garbage, I mean, even though I'm kind of angry right now, but I mean, they're just walking hypocrites. They literally hold 2 separate opinions, 2 opinions that immediately conflict with one another, and they hold these opinions as a scientific truism, which must be spread all over the planet to the disdain and anger. The next source of heat originates from what is known as tidal friction. Tidal friction is the concept of the gravitational pull of the moon and, to technically a lesser extent, the sun. What happens is that the pull of gravity, the forces of gravity from these 2 bodies, they interact with the Earth. So basically what's going on is that these forces would be essentially pulling at the planet Earth. If you have something pulling, right, you've got a movement of a force. If you have that, you are going to generate heat. Now, this is where things kind of get weird because the concept of tidal friction, there's not technically anything wrong with that. Like that, you know, we can see tidal, the concept is sound. But is that what is actually happening on Earth? The problem with using tidal friction to explain where all of this heat is coming from, not all of it, I mean, okay, they're not claiming all of the heat is coming from this, but if you're going to use tidal friction as a source of your heat, you have to explain why, for some weird reason, only the interior of the planet heats up and not the exterior of the planet. So what I mean by that is that tidal friction does not just interact within the Earth, it would interact with everything on Earth too. It would not just be in the center of the planet or in the various layers, on the crust as well, where you and I are currently sitting and listening to this trash. We would also and should also experience tidal friction heat as well. We're not doing that. You have never been standing under a full moon and had the ground melt under you. There's no heat being generated at the degree necessary to create the kind of processes that we witness in plate tectonics. It's just not there. It's not that tidal friction is not a legit concept, but to use it as something that explains a large source of heat, it doesn't really work because we don't observe that. right? You do not have a pool of lava appear under you in your city when you are essentially between the moon and the sun. You have never once in your life wondered if today was the day when you see the moon that your entire town was going to sink into lava. The reason why that doesn't happen, and the reason why you've never thought about that, is simple. The tidal forces that we are talking about, they simply do not generate that kind of energy. It's not there. So if we don't witness it at the surface, where we should expect to see it at that scale with respect to heat, why the hell do we think it's happening at the center of the Earth? It doesn't make sense. So the tidal friction situation, that's a weird one. I don't even know why they put that in there. That's where they're like grasping at straws, in all honesty. Like that, they just threw that stuff in there into their little list because it makes them sound smart. I'm actually willing to bet that is why that is there, because tidal friction will never, at least in the current configuration that we are in right now, it will never generate the kind of heat required to move huge chunks of land across a semi-liquid mass of magma, right? It's just not happening. So tidal friction, that's a weird one. We can set that to the side, right? And so, okay. Now, this brings us to the last major claim made by mainstream geologists on where the heat to run all of plate tectonics comes from, and that process is known as radioactive decay. Right now, geologists currently believe that the primary source for all of this heat, and this would have to be the primary source because as we just went over the other two examples, those other two processes for heat generation were extremely weak and stupid. So there's no real reason to factor any of that crap in. And I think they know that because they still needed to figure out where the hell the energy came from. So they eventually settled on radioactive decay. Don't worry, if you do not know what radioactive decay is, I am here for you. All elements have what we call a half-life. This would be the time that it takes for half of the atoms in the sample to decay. And this decay can be measured. When this decay happens, we call it emitting an isotope. So basically, radioactive decay is just a natural process by which an unstable atomic nucleus loses its energy by emitting radiation. This process essentially transforms the original atom into a more stable form of whatever it's currently at that time, after it emits one of its nucleus parts. You like how scientific that was? Yeah, very nice. When it does this, what happens is that the element essentially starts to decay, and interestingly enough, it can create another element. Right? So if you kick out some unstable isotopes from, for example, I don't know, uranium-238, uranium-238 will decay into thorium-234. Or for example, I don't know, I think it's potassium-40 can also decay into argon-40 or calcium-40, maybe both of them, something like that. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Anyways, it's very interesting, right? Atoms decay, they become other things, and we are able to measure this. That is actually legitimate science, no problem there. When these atoms start to decay and they kick out those isotopes, it releases radiation. This radiation is also heat. Basically, geologists believe right now that there's just tons of these radioactive isotopes constantly decaying in the center of the Earth, and they are all emitting tremendous amounts of heat. So all this heat then gets released, it travels upwards towards the crust, and as it does that, it starts to melt stuff, it starts to heat things up, and eventually all of this heat would create the situation that is hypothesized right now by mainstream geologists. Now, if you're a layperson and you were to read this list, you'd probably just nod your head and be like, oh yeah, that sounds very scientific. These guys, they really know what they're talking about. And then, of course, that person goes on about their day. That person is not an idiot. That person is trusting the intellectual accuracy of mainstream geologists. Of course, upon even just a little scrutinizing of their explanations, we immediately find all kinds of problems. In fact, when you think about it, so far, all three of these major points that we've just gone over that are supposed to support the theory of plate tectonics and where the heat came from, these are all pretty piss-poor explanations for their theory. And we'll get way more into that in a second though. But honestly, I believe that these three concepts were just the best that they could grab at. I mean, these guys were basically grabbing at straws or throwing crap against the wall hoping that it sticks, because otherwise the concept of plate tectonics has no real way of generating the kind of energy required to get those plates moving across the planet, especially the way that mainstream geologists claim they do. I seriously believe that all three of these points were just, well, it sounds good, you guys. Let's go in that direction, and now we have our answer, so we don't have to worry about some other problems anymore. Just start doing this. I think that's what they did, in all honesty. I honestly believe that. Did I say that enough? Did I honestly believe what I honestly believe? Okay, really quick, let's go over the basic concepts of what they believe the radioactive decay within Earth is doing, and then we will go on to all of the other problems with the theory. So, if the radioactive decay part of the theory is correct, there's got to be some kind of evidence, right? I mean, we know that mainstream geologists will, just make guesses and say they're true, but when it comes to something like radioactivity or dealing with atoms, etc., we actually have a decent chunk of science and knowledge with respect to this area. So, we might actually be able to find something relative to the concept. And sure enough, they do make a case for finding it. So, for example, I think I already mentioned it. So, there are elements such as uranium-238, thorium-232, potassium-40. Those elements are all found in large concentrations in the Earth's crust and mantle. Now, proving that this stuff is in the mantle assumes that the mantle is a real layer. Don't forget, we actually do not have proof of every single layer that mainstream geologists currently say exists. I'm not saying that they're not right now with what they have. It's possible that they are right. I don't know. But at the other side of the coin, we actually do not have the 100% scientific proved evidence that supports that something like the crust or the mantle exists. Obviously, the crust exists. We're living on it, right? So I'm fine with the crust. Anyway, they're assuming that lava that's coming out of those volcanoes and stuff like that, they just assume all of that originates in the mantle. We do not have 100% scientifically proved evidence that this is the case. It's entirely possible that there are other processes that we are just not familiar with and have no idea about that are creating magma pockets within the Earth's crust. I'm not going to go I'm not even going to go any more into that. I'm just throwing that out there to just remember that we do not know every single layer of this planet like mainstream geologists think we do know. All right, just keep that in mind as we talk about plate tectonics. It's going to be important because for plate tectonics to be a legitimate theory, all of these layers essentially have to be real. So if some of these layers are wrong, especially something like the mantle, obviously we have problems. Okay, anyway. So on the surface, the logic for radioactive decay measuring, where the heat comes from, etc., isn't a bad idea. However, there is an immediate problem. And the immediate problem that we instantly run into is that we have no proof that all of those elements were created on Earth. We just don't have that evidence. All of those elements could have been created somewhere else and then had been put into Earth, or, whenever the hell Earth was created, Earth could have absorbed those materials already in that isotopic state. Geologists always forget to tell people that in order for that particular concept, radioactive isotopes being measured from the amount of all of these elements that we find in the crust, would require geologists knowing for a fact that all of that stuff originated on Earth. We don't have that proof. And the reason why we don't have that proof is because we still don't know where the hell Earth came from. Geologists were not sitting back on the planet, 100 million years ago or 2 billion years ago or whatever, sitting there with a camera and watching all of these elements form on Earth so that, millions of years later, they could decay. We do not have any proof at all that these elements originated on Earth. Geologists literally just assume that all of these elements existed during the time of Earth's creation in their previous form. What they don't factor in is the possibility that all of these decayed elements could have created Earth long after they had already decayed. What that means is that all of these elements that supposedly decayed on Earth may never have decayed on Earth. If they never decayed on Earth, that means they never supplied any heat whatsoever to the planet. That's a pretty big problem, and it is one that geologists will never tell you about. They will never admit that that is an actual problem that they have got to figure out. And essentially, it's impossible. I mean, you would literally need a time machine to go back in time billions of years ago so that you could go double check to make sure that all of these elements were present before they decayed. We don't have that proof. So that's a problem. And that's a problem because one of the main pieces of evidence that geologists use is all of the stuff that they have found on the surface of the planet. Don't forget, geologists are not drilling down like 100 miles into the Earth's core, right? They're not doing anything like that. Basically, what geologists are doing is they are looking at the surface of Earth and they are assuming that all of the elements that we find on the surface exist all the way down to the core. They are assuming that there is more or less an equal distribution of all of these elements all the way down to essentially the core of the planet. And they are assuming this. This is an assumption. They are taking a blind guess. If you were to put a geologist on the spot and ask them or demand from them a core sample from 200 miles below the Earth's surface showing you this even distribution, they wouldn't have it. They literally wouldn't be able to do anything for you. The only thing they would be able to do would be they would either appeal to authority. They could say, well, I mean, all these great geologists, they all believe it. The consensus says, right? The consensus, that's what it is. I have a happy degree, everybody agrees with me, and it's the consensus, so it must be real. If you challenge them on a scientific basis, you get nothing, right? They have nothing. There's no physical evidence for this. So the concept of radioactive decay, creating all of the heat necessary to move large land masses, is based on an assumption of an assumption. It is insane. Now, I get it. There's mainstream people who will immediately come back and say, but our simulations and our models and estimates of isotopic abundances in the mantle and the crust and their relative decay should create all of the heat. I mean, that's our proof. Really? Really? You are going to tell me that your simulations and your estimates and your models are scientific evidence proving your theory? That is not how science works. You can run simulations, you can have estimates, but those are not admissible scientific evidence. For example, if you run a simulation trying to prove plate tectonics, then that means you have coded your simulation to prove plate tectonics. What that means is that the people running the simulation are only going to inject data that will prove what the simulation was designed to prove. And of course, the simulation designed to prove plate tectonics is never going to prove anything else. It might prove that it doesn't work because as they keep trying to shove things into their simulation, they'll find that, yeah, it's not really working, but they're not going to admit that it doesn't work. Instead, what a geologist will say is, well, we're just, we're still messing with the simulation. We need to fine tune it, but we're sure plate tectonics is real. We just need to get the simulation coded, correctly so that it proves our theory based on assumptions. And this right here, this is how mainstream geology operates. This is what these people do. They take their simulation and they say this is proof of their theory. that is not science. That is a simulation that is designed to give you the exact outcome that you want, right? What that means is that any one of us could create any kind of simulation we want, shove it in front of a geologist, and then tell them that that is proof of our insane theory. For example, I don't know, maybe cotton candy is at the center of the earth, and I don't know, little gumdrop gingerbread men move the continents around, and I can show them a simulation that proves this, and that means that I have the exact same kind of proof that they have for plate tectonics. Who is the correct one? Is the cotton candy core theory correct, or is it the molten core theory? It doesn't matter, because both have the exact same kind of evidence. This is why it's perfectly acceptable to start hunting these people in the halls and just grab them by the neck and start choking them, just start slapping the shit. Another aspect of the radioactive decay theory that geologists believe prove their point is with respect to the measurements of the flow of heat from the Earth's interior to the surface. Basically, roughly half of the heat that they have measured has been attributed to radioactive decay. Now, of course, this is only based on models and estimates of isotopic abundances in the mantle and the crust, and of course, further down as well. So once again, we run into the exact same problem. They don't actually have any proof of the existences of all of these elements that are decaying. They just assume they are there. And what's even more funny is that the fact that they think only about half of the heat that is generated comes from radioactive decay, that's interesting in itself, because to move a continent, you need a lot of energy. So that means that the rest of the heat required is being generated from the residual heat of the creation of the planet 4.5 billion years ago, which, that's insane. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the other source of the heat is from tidal friction. So that's a lot of heat. And I said earlier on with respect to tidal friction is obviously not generating that much heat, but it's got to generate quite a chunk of it if only 50% of the world's heat being generated can be attributed to isotopic decay. That's a serious problem, because we do not have scientific observational evidence of that kind of heat being generated from tidal friction. It's just not happening. So right here, just with talking about these several aspects, we run into some serious problems with respect to heat generation. I was going to try and get through this entire concept in one show, but it looks like we will now be doing a two-parter. Right, so we'll just focus on radioactive decay, and then we'll kind of wrap it up, and then we'll continue with all this plate tectonic trash in another episode. So another piece of evidence that geologists will use is what they call geoneutrino observations. Now, geoneutrinos are essentially antineutrinos emitted during radioactive decay. This has been measured, so I don't have a problem with it. However, of course, geologists, they just assume, once again, that all of this stuff is happening, towards the center of the planet, and this decay is just going on as a natural process. However, they still do not have proof that the elements that are creating this decay actually exists down there. This is the problem, right? They're just assuming, once again, that the stuff they find on the crust is identical to the stuff in the core, or at least towards the center anyway. So while that decay process has been measured, we have no reason to believe, necessarily speaking, that it is coming from the elements that they say it's coming from. Is it possible that there is another process that is creating these antineutrinos? Now, earlier in the show, I had challenged you guys to see if you could find the one missing scientific process that we know for a fact is taking place on Earth, and that could potentially drive the planet's energy needs. If your answer for the missing process was Birkeland currents, congratulations! You are now more intelligent than 99.9% of the planet. And if you didn't, don't worry about it. I'm not getting on you. We're all learning this stuff together. But there is another process that could potentially create this situation. And that would be the Birkeland current that currently runs through the planet Earth. And we know this is a fact. We know for a fact that Birkeland currents do indeed run through the planet. If you have that kind of a plasma electrical flow going through the planet, you now have a situation that could create the conditions that would extract antineutrinos from elements. This might actually be the explanation as to why we see that. Now, I'm jumping ahead anyway, but I'm only saying that because we're at the end of the show, and I'm tired of talking about this because it's pissing me off. Okay, anyway, so that's another portion of the radioactive situation. What other garbage do they have? Oh, yeah, this is a good one. The geochemical evidence that they have. So check this out. They actually use meteorites as proxies for what geologists assume was the original composition of our solar system. Now, that's not exactly like a horrible idea, but once you realize that the accretion disk model is trash, and you also realize that if you're going to say that this stuff has hung around for like 10 billion years, you better be able to prove that. These guys actually use meteorites in their isotopic measurements to see what the decay in the meteorites equals so they can test it against the Earth, and then they compare the results, and then they say, hey, look, we have our 100% proof. We found a meteorite that exactly agrees with our theory. Ignore all the other meteorites, but this meteorite 100% agrees. That's the problem with the meteorite as a proxy evidence. This is the stupid one. I don't even know why I said it, right? I said it because I wanted to show how ridiculous their evidence gets, right? They just assume that the meteors that they get are the exact same composition of Earth, 4 billion years ago, whatever the age is, right? James Webb Telescope has completely changed all of that. And of course, they're not updating their theories to represent that, but whatever. So we find a situation to where mainstream geologists, they're just grasping at straws, desperately trying to prove the theory of plate tectonics. Now, why do we want to get rid of the theory of plate tectonics? What is this going to do for us in the future? It's going to do a few things. The first thing is that it keeps us scientifically honest, right? It keeps us grounded. It's okay to say, I don't know, because the reality is we don't know everything. We're going to do another show and we'll go over more of the problems and we'll talk about more of the other possibilities that could explain why we see what we see here. But, we can't do that if we're stuck on a theory that provides no actual answers. And to make it even worse, it's a theory based on some of the most corrupt concepts you can imagine, right? This stuff is only pushed purely because of authoritative practices. And that's it. I don't know what else to say. There's no evidence for it. So we find a situation with the theory of plate tectonics to where one of the most basic processes of the theory, and that would be the generation of the heat, does not stand up to even the most basic scientific scrutiny. At the very least, it doesn't stand up enough to claim that it is a useful theory. There's really no reason to even suppose plate tectonics. In the next show, we'll start to cover more of the details and everything like that. But at least here, the main takeaway from everything that we just blabbed about here is just we need to understand that the primary driving force, the heat generation, it doesn't work the way geologists want it to work. The evidence is not there to support it. It's important that we eliminate all of this stuff, because if we are going to try and make sense of what has actually happened on this planet, we don't need to look at this stuff. There's no reason to waste our time trying to factor in all of this theoretical garbage. And don't forget, that's exactly what this is. It's just trash. It's just geologists trying to satisfy their desire for instant gratification. If geologists were intellectually and scientifically being honest, that they would teach as many theories as they possibly could, because we know for a scientific fact that we do not know what is actually going on this planet. relative to the processes that would create the geological formations that we see today. Now, of course, this is going to be important because if we are going to look back at history and we are going to try and take all of that stuff that our ancestors talk about with respect to the gods literally forming the planet and messing with the planet and the planets, we have to get rid of garbage concepts. And plate tectonics is a garbage concept. There's no way around this, all right? I'm not saying I'm not still open to it. If a geologist could legitimately prove to us, unequivocally, with real evidence, fine, so be it. But everything we've gone over right now, just at the basic level of the theory of plate tectonics, the information is not there. The science just does not exist. There's no reason to teach plate tectonics as a fact, as a foundation for geology. In the next show, we will go into more details and we will continue to tear down the theory of plate tectonics, and then we'll discuss other possibilities of what could have created the geological formations that we currently see on this planet. And of course, these formations are things that our ancestors have creation stories about. Instead of ignoring our ancestors like mainstream historians do, we are going to take them seriously. We are going to respect what our ancestors recorded so that we can learn from the past, unlike a mainstream historian. I swear to God.